The marble glistened under the Roman sun, but beneath its polished surface, the empire was rotting. Historians chronicled the victories, the architecture, the grandeur. What they rarely confessed was the blood-soaked path carved by emperors who wielded absolute power, not for justice, but for terror. These were not rulers. They were tyrants cloaked in togas. They came to power through murder, bribery, blackmail, and once enthroned, they ruled like gods unchained. Their crimes weren't hidden in shadows. They were paraded before terrified senators, sobbing slaves. In silent soldiers, Rome's greatest horror wasn't the barbarians at the gates, it was the emperors inside the palace. The Senate bowed and cheered. The people tossed flowers, but behind those masks was fear. Fear of being noticed, of being next. For when an emperor turned his eyes upon you, it was already too late. The first to bathe in infamy was Caligula. Born Gaius, Julius Caesar, Germanicus, he began his reign as a beloved heir. The army adored him, the public cheered him. Months. The mask slipped, and madness gripped the empire. It started with whispers that he wandered the palace at night, speaking to the moon. That he made his horse Incitus a priest. That he forced senators to run beside his chariot like slaves. But these were only the amusements of a disturbed god. The real horrors were much worse. He invited nobles to dine, only to have them dragged out mid-meal and executed on false charges. Their wives were taken to his chambers, defiled, and returned broken. Caligula didn't hide his crimes. He boasted of them. Let them hate me, he laughed, so long as they fear me, he declared himself. A living god and demanded sacrifices. Statues of Jupiter were beheaded and replaced with his likeness. He ordered a bridge of ships built across the Bay of Bai, only to gallop across it in golden armor, laughing at the cost in coin and lives. When Rome protested, Caligula punished the people. He taxed marriage, lawsuits, even breathing, literally, imposing a tax on air. He would stare from his balcony, watching for anyone who failed to clap long enough, smile wide enough, kneel low enough. Then came the incest. His sisters Drusilla, Julia, Livilla, and Agrippina were not spared. Drusilla was said to be his favorite, treated as both wife and prisoner. When she died, he declared a national mourning. He also threatened to declare war on Neptune, the god of the sea, because the tides disrupted his games. But it wasn't madness alone that made Caligula monstrous. It was pleasure. He enjoyed pain. Once he locked a man inside a cage and ordered him to be slowly eaten by wild dogs, limb by limb. He sat and ate grapes as the screams echoed. His end came as brutally as his reign. The Praetorian Guard, once his protectors, grew sick of his sadism. In a narrow corridor beneath the theater, they fell upon him with daggers. Even as he bled out, he laughed. But Rome's nightmare did not end there. In the ashes of Caligula rose another demon in a toga. Nero, the last of the Julio-Claudian line, he ascended the throne as a teenage puppet. His mother, Agrippina the younger, thought she could control him. She had murdered her own husband to place him on the throne. But Nero, once crowned, learned quickly. First he rid himself of his teacher, the philosopher Seneca, and then his mother. He tried poison, collapsing balconies, even a rigged boat to drown her. Agrippina survived them all until Nero ordered her stabbed in her villa. Her last words, "Strike the womb that bore him." Nero ruled through paranoia and pleasure. He sang in theaters while people were forced to applaud under threat of death. He raced chariots through the streets at night, often disguised, attacking citizens for sport. Rome trembled, not from invasion, but from its emperor's whims. Then came the fire, in 64 CE. Flames tore through Rome. For 6 days, the eternal city burned. Rumors swirled that Nero had ordered it, wanting space to build his golden palace. Witnesses claimed they saw imperial guards setting fires and blocking escape routes. As the smoke cleared, Nero found a scapegoat: the Christians. Thousands were arrested, tortured, and slaughtered. Some were torn apart by dogs. Others were crucified and burned alive to light Nero's gardens. The crowd cheered, not out of joy but survival. Nero decorated his Domus Aurea with lakes, golden statues, and dining rooms with rotating ceilings, all while the people starved. He murdered his pregnant wife Poppaea with a kick to the stomach. Then later, feeling regret, he found a young boy who resembled her, had him castrated, dressed in her robes, and married him. Rome's dignity was a distant memory as revolts rose and provinces rebelled. Nero fled. Deserted and disgraced, he stabbed himself in the throat. His final words, "What an artist dies in me." The Republic never returned. The throne simply changed hands from one madman to the next. Enter Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius. While his father was a Stoic philosopher king, Commodus was a butcher in silk, fancied himself Hercules reborn. Fighting in gladiator arenas, but only against maimed or weakened foes. He charged Rome for each of his victories, draining the treasury to fund his ego. He renamed months after himself and had statues made of him in lion skins, wielding a club. Senators who refused to worship him were executed. Others were forced to fight in the arena. He once cut off a man's nose, then laughed as lions were. Unleashed upon him, the crowd watched in horror. Speaking against him was suicide. Remaining silent was survival. His mistress Marcia eventually poisoned his wine. When it failed to kill him, a wrestler was sent to strangle him in his bath. 3 emperors. 3 monsters. And still, the blood had only begun to flow. The crimes of Caligula. Nero and Commodus were etched in the bones of Rome. But others, worse, darker, remained buried in silence. Emperors whose names were struck from monuments. Whose cruelty was whispered in cellars, never written on scrolls. But now, those crimes rise again, torn from the shadows of time. The next emperor on this descent into darkness. Tiberius. Tiberius was no mad gladiator like Commodus, no theatrical arsonist like Nero. He ruled with silence, a silence more suffocating than screams. His terror came not from spectacle, but from shadows. And in those shadows, he committed crimes that Roman historians could barely whisper. He became emperor reluctantly after Augustus' stepfather adopted him. But once power seeped into his veins, it poisoned him completely. His reign began with cold efficiency and ended in depravity so obscene that even Rome used to blood and lust. Lynched, he withdrew from public life early, retreating to the island of Capri. Officially, it was for health. Unofficially, it became a haven for unspeakable indulgence. His villa Hobus, perched on the cliffs like a vulture's nest. No senator dared refuse an invitation, though many who visited Capri never returned. The emperor had filled the palace with boys and girls taken from across the empire, trained to perform perverse acts for his amusement. They were called his minnows. Taught to swim between his legs and pleasure him in bathhouses, artists later depicted these scenes in crude mosaics that were swiftly buried by fearful successors. But even darker than lust was his paranoia. Tiberius trusted no one. His closest advisor, Sejanus, was a ruthless climber who began eliminating rivals under the emperor's silent approval. One by one, prominent families were accused of treason. Executions soared. Torture chambers in Rome overflowed. Eyes were everywhere in the Senate, in temples, in homes. And when Tiberius grew suspicious of Sejanus himself, he turned. He lured him into a false sense of security, then had him arrested mid-ceremony and strangled in prison. Even the youngest, a toddler, was strangled because Roman law forbade executing virgins, so she was. First raped, Tiberius died as he lived, detested, feared, and alone. Some say he was smothered by his own successor, others that he finally succumbed to disease. Either way, Rome did not mourn him. The people rejoiced. But the empire had not yet seen its darkest hour. That hour belonged to Elagabalus. He came from the east, a teenage priest of the sun god Elagabal, thrust onto the throne through his grandmother's schemes. But Rome was not prepared for him, and he cared nothing for Rome. Elagabalus wore makeup, dressed in silk robes, and insisted on being called empress. He married men, then women, then men again. He offered gold to any surgeon who could transform him into a woman, a twisted precursor to forced experimentation. But these were merely the surface scandals. He desecrated temples, replacing Jupiter with his own god. The sacred stone of Eligable was dragged through the streets, and senators were forced to bow before it. He held lavish orgies in the palace, where nobles were selected at random to be stripped and humiliated before slaves. He allegedly prostituted himself in the imperial palace, standing naked at the door and offering his body to any passerby. Guards often found him hiding in closets, dressed as a concubine, awaiting clients. But worse than the sex was the cruelty. Elagabalus delighted in killing animals in front of children. He served peacock brains and flamingo tongues, while the poor starved outside his palace gates. He fed guests food laced with glass or induced vomiting to make room for more. Once he smothered a banquet hall in rose petals, so many that guests suffocated beneath them. Rome's elite plotted. Even his grandmother, who once schemed to put him on the throne, turned against him. He and his mother were dragged through the streets, their bodies mutilated and tossed into the Tiber. The empire exhaled, but it was a temporary gasp, because next came Domitian, the last of the Flavians. Handsome, quiet, intelligent, and utterly merciless. Domitian began with promise. He repaired the economy, strengthened borders, and supported the arts. But soon, his love for control twisted into obsession. He demanded to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. He ruled by decree, bypassing the Senate entirely. Those who challenged him were quietly erased. Rome became a city of spies, where friends betrayed friends and brothers betrayed brothers. Domitian kept a secret scroll of those who had offended him. It grew longer each day. Even a minor complaint about taxation could mean death. He executed senators in waves. The courts no longer offered justice, only punishment. He prowled the palace at night, sword in hand, slashing at shadows, he believed. Traitors were everywhere. He exiled philosophers, burned books, and filled dungeons with the accused. Torture became routine, and executions were public theater. His own wife conspired in his assassination. A freedman stabbed him in the groin, and others joined in until he bled out on the marble floor. His memory was damned by the Senate, his name chiseled from monuments, but some crimes were too vast to erase. Caracalla brought new horror, son of Septimius Severus. He shared the throne with his brother Geta briefly. Within months, he had Geta murdered in their mother's arms. Blood splattered her dress. Caracalla outlawed even the mention of his brother's name. He declared himself the new Alexander the Great, and sought to rule with the same ruthless ambition. He massacred thousands in Alexandria after the citizens mocked him in plays. Whole neighborhoods were burned. Bodies stacked like cordwood in the streets. He extended Roman citizenship to all free men in the empire, not out of equality. To increase tax revenue, the poor remained poor. The rich were hunted for their estates. Paranoid and cruel, Caracalla traveled with a personal executioner. He trusted no one. And yet, Zen came from within. A soldier he insulted while relieving himself stabbed him to death on the roadside. And so the cycle. Repeated blood. Succession. More blood. Maximinus, Thrax, Didius, Julianus, Gaius, Verus, Maximus. Names less remembered, but no less monstrous. Thrax drained the treasury and starved the Senate. Julianus bought the empire in an auction. Verus Maximus followed his father's sadism, crucifying nobles on rumor alone. These were emperors who viewed Rome not as a republic, not even as an empire, but as personal playgrounds, theaters for their egos and appetites. The cries of the victims were muffled by time, buried beneath layers of marble and myth. But history remembers. It remembers the screams behind the glory, the shadows behind the triumphal arches, the blood behind the gold. And there was one more ruler, perhaps the most depraved of them all, whose crimes were so disturbing, many Roman historians dared not write them. That man was Lucius Aurelius Commodus Antoninus, Again, the son of an emperor. The killer of the empire's last hope, Commodus, was not content with being an emperor. He needed to be a spectacle. Though his crimes had already stained the pages of Rome's history, what remained untold was how deep his obsession with control and death truly ran. He ruled not as a statesman, but as a gladiator, a god. And a madman rolled into one. He didn't just fight in the arena, he slaughtered. Dozens of disabled or wounded gladiators were lined up for him to kill effortlessly. He ordered wild animals, ostriches, lions, even elephants, tethered or wounded before entering the Colosseum to hunt them. His bow would fire from a distance, and when the beast fell, he'd raise his arms like a divine conqueror. The people, under threat, cheered. Senators were humiliated routinely. Commodus renamed Rome Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus, and changed the calendar months to reflect his names. Statues of him as Hercules replaced Jupiter. He declared that no one should be born without his approval, nor buried without his blessing. Even urinating in public latrines required imperial consent, a madness that paralyzed daily life. He would take commoners into the palace, dress them in finery, and make them dine with senators, forcing nobles to bow before prostitutes and slaves. Then, on a whim, he might order those same men and women executed in the arena the next day for his pleasure. But Commodus' death was not just necessary, it was overdue. His mistress Marcia, along with a chamberlain and a praetorian prefect, slipped poison into his wine. When it failed, a wrestler named Narcissus was summoned and strangled the emperor in his bathtub. The empire breathed, but not for long. After Commodus' death, Rome descended into civil chaos. In a single year, 5 emperors rose and fell. The throne had become a death sentence. One of them, Didius Julianus, literally bought the empire from the Praetorian Guard, auctioning the crown like a market item. He was beheaded in his palace. Then came Septimius Severus, who brought temporary stability, but ensured his sons would inherit not wisdom but hatred. After his death, Caracalla's crime against his brother sealed Rome's future in blood. But what of the emperors whose darkness didn't manifest in public shows, but in calculated terror? Domitian's legacy whispered through the palaces, long after his bones turned to dust. His secret police, the Delatoris, filed accusations in the dark. Neighbors disappeared overnight. Trials became executions. People were convicted for dreams, for murmurs, for frowns. Senators died by the dozens. Heads were paraded through the forum. Torturers were paid bonuses for creativity. A young girl accused of insulting the emperor was stripped, whipped, and crucified in secret. Her name was erased from records. Only her screams survived in rumor. Domitian's paranoia drove him to retreat deep into the palace. Walls thickened. Doors barred. He lined rooms with mirrors to watch behind him. His last day was no surprise to anyone but him. Freedmen stabbed him in the groin, and the wound tore deeper than his delusions. Then there was Maximinus Thrax, a towering peasant, turned emperor. He was known for his strength and for his brutality. He taxed the elite into ruin, slaughtered entire senatorial families to steal their estates, and marched across provinces like a conquering brute. He executed his own generals when they became popular, murdered his advisors if they hesitated. One winter, as Rome starved, Maximinus ordered golden statues of himself erected in every province. Even as legions froze and starved at the front lines, when his army finally turned against him, they stormed his camp, cut off his head, and marched it to Rome, a final insult to tyranny. But not all the cruelty came from emperors obsessed with death. Some were obsessed with spectacle, debauchery, or godhood. One emperor ordered a Colosseum flooded with wine instead of water, while citizens died of thirst. Another forced guests at a feast to eat their own relatives' ashes, disguised as spice. Some emperors used forced suicide as a political tool. Others would arrive by imperial courier, ordering a noble to die with dignity. Failure to comply meant public execution and disgrace for their family. Many slit their wrists in warm baths, the preferred method, while friends read poetry or played flutes to soften the moment. This was not mercy, it was theater. Then came the tales too vile for scrolls. In one case, an emperor forced a mother to watch the rape of her daughter before both were strangled, simply because the father had questioned a tax law. In another, a man was boiled alive in front of the Senate, while musicians played to drown out his screams, and in the darkest corners of Roman memory was the practice of damnatio memoria, the systematic erasure of a person's existence. Names chiseled off monuments, portraits burned, family lands seized, even tombs desecrated and scattered. It was the final cruelty, not just to kill, but to make it as though one had never lived. The emperors wielded this power mercilessly. It was used not only on enemies, but on family, brothers, wives, sons. When an emperor feared a legacy stronger than his own, he destroyed it. The question that lingered in Rome's rotting soul was never who will rule next. It was how long before the next horror begins. And in that silence, the silence after each death, each scream, Rome's greatness became a mask for unspeakable evil. Behind its temples, its roads, its marble monuments, stood the truth that power, when unchecked, turns men into monsters, and the monsters of Rome wore laurel crowns. By the 3rd century, the empire was splintering. Civil wars, assassinations, and bankrupt treasuries ravaged its core. But with every collapse came another emperor, more savage, more unstable, more detached from reality. The bloodletting wasn't slowing, it was accelerating. Gaius Verus Maximus, son of Maximinus Thrax, was only a teenager when his father forced him into Coral. He watched his father execute governors, drain the Senate of gold, and strangle dissent in its infancy. Maximus learned one lesson: mercy was weakness. While his father rampaged across provinces, Maximus stayed behind in the imperial court. There he turned cruelty into entertainment. He ordered prisoners be sewn into the carcasses of dead animals and thrown to wild dogs just to see how long they'd scream. He would make jesters duel blindfolded with real blades. The winner lived, the loser died, usually bleeding before the throne. Even in youth, he believed fear made better subjects than law. He demanded tributes from cities already starving. Father approved of everything until the Senate revolted. Both were assassinated, their heads sent back to Rome in wine-soaked sacks. The empire was tired of brutes, but unable to produce anything else. Then came a short reign, barely a whisper in history: Didius Julianus. He had purchased the throne from the Praetorian Guard, a literal auction held in the palace barracks. His only crime was greed, but it was enough. Rome couldn't tolerate a man who treated its legacy like merchandise. He lasted just over 2 months. When soldiers dragged him to execution, he screamed, "But what wrong have I done?" "Who have?" "I killed." The answer: none. But in Rome, that made him suspicious. The following decades saw a carousel of emperors, all desperate, most doomed. Some tried reform, others clung to power through bribery and spectacle. But the disease had taken hold. Absolute power demanded. Absolute loyalty, and loyalty born of fear, always shattered. Among them rose Aurelian, a military genius credited with saving Rome, but his methods were brutal. He massacred rebellious cities and impaled prisoners by the thousands. He once had an entire garrison buried alive for mutiny.
How?
His nickname? Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world, but for those beneath his heel. He was a butcher cloaked in victory, and yet even Aurelian feared betrayal. He began compiling lists of suspected traitors, convinced his court was plotting against him. His paranoia grew so intense that his own secretary, fearing execution, preemptively forged a conspiracy. That forgery led to Aurelian's assassination. Irony ruled the empire now. One emperor attempted to abolish executions. He lasted 8 months. Another tried to reinstate Senate power. He was stabbed in his bed by his own guard. A third declared he would rule in the image of Augustus and was publicly dismembered. Then came Diocletian, who divided the empire and enforced order with an iron hand. His greatest crime was not indulgence, but persecution in the twilight. Of his reign, He launched the Great Persecution, the bloodiest war on Christianity the empire had ever seen. Churches were razed, scriptures burned, thousands were imprisoned, tortured, and killed. Some were flayed alive, others had molten lead poured into their mouths. Diocletian's edicts outlawed Christian worship entirely. And while his administrative reforms lasted centuries, the rivers of blood did too. Diocletian retired, the only emperor to do so willingly. But the empire he left behind was scarred by the religion he tried to erase. Later, Constantine would reverse that tide. But even he, the so-called Christian emperor, had blood on his hands. He executed his son Crispus and his wife Fausta under mysterious charges, possibly adultery, possibly conspiracy. The truth was buried with their bodies, but Constantine, who legalized Christianity, stained it with personal murder. The lesson of Rome's emperors was simple. Power always demanded sacrifice, and that sacrifice was human. Even those emperors, who tried to govern wisely, eventually succumbed to fear. A trusted friend could become a rival overnight. A son might harbor ambition, a general too many victories. Suspicion was death for both the suspect and, eventually, the emperor himself. As the Western Empire decayed, emperors became puppets. Germanic warlords pulled strings from behind velvet curtains. But the cruelty remained. One last name whispered. In Rome's dying days was Valentinian I. Known for his temper so violent, he once beat a courtier to death with his bare hands during an audience. When he died, it was of apoplexy, a burst blood vessel in the brain, after a furious rant at a Germanic envoy. Rage had literally killed him, but even as Rome fell, its sins were not forgotten. The crimes of its emperors, the children drowned, the women violated, the cities erased, echoed through history. No aqueduct or amphitheater could wash away the truth. The marble forums crumbled, the Colosseum cracked, but the ghosts remained. They say history is written by the victors. In Rome, the victors were the cruelest, and the historians the most terrified. Scrolls were censored, names erased, temples rededicated, crimes buried under fresh paint. But time remembers what ink does. Not. And so, when you walk the ruins of Rome, listen carefully. The stones speak, not in Latin, but in sorrow. Not of glory, but of warning. The emperors were men and monsters and some crimes. No matter how deeply buried, never stay silent forever. As the Western Empire staggered into its final centuries, its emperors became shadows, ruling briefly, dying suddenly, often forgotten. But even in its twilight, Rome still produced men capable of horrors as vile as any from its golden age. Take Honorius, crowned emperor at just 10 years old. While Rome was being sacked by Alaric and the Visigoths, Honorius remained in Ravenna, surrounded by luxuries and convinced that the capital's fate was a distant inconvenience. When informed that Rome has perished, he reportedly burst into tears, not for the city, but for his pet chicken, also named Roma, thinking it had died. That moment, however absurd, encapsulated the collapse of imperial Rome, disconnected, decadent, and disturbingly cold. But Honorius' negligence had consequences. As his generals fought one another, entire regions fell. Cities were burned, populations slaughtered, women taken as war prizes. He did nothing too consumed by court politics and creature comforts to care. Then came Valentinian III, a puppet emperor who relied on others to rule while plotting in shadows. When his greatest general, Flavius Idius, secured victory over Attila the Hun and began gaining respect, Valentinian struck literally. In a private meeting, he drew his own sword and stabbed Idius to death in front of stunned courtiers. Was it well done? He asked them, eyes wide. One replied, "You have cut off your right hand with your left." Soon after, 2 of Idius's loyal officers murdered Valentinian in the Forum, in broad daylight. His reign had ended just as cowardly as it had begun, in betrayal. And then came the last gasp, Romulus Augustulus, the boy emperor who symbolized the fall. He ruled barely a year before being overthrown by the barbarian chieftain Odoacer. Life was spared a mercy rarely granted in Roman politics, but his reign marked the end of the Western Roman Empire. Or did it? Because in the East, in Constantinople, the Byzantine emperors carried Rome's legacy and its sins for centuries more. Justinian I, hailed as a great reformer and church builder, was also responsible for the Nika riots, a citywide revolt where tens of thousands of citizens were slaughtered in the hippodrome at his command. His wife Theodora, once a courtesan, urged him not to flee but to crush the people. He did, with mercenaries who turned the arena into a charnel. House and Phocas, a lowly soldier turned emperor by coup, was perhaps the most sadistic ruler Constantinople ever knew. He butchered his predecessor Maurus and forced him to watch his sons executed, one by one, before his own throat was cut. Phocas delighted in torment, dismembering opponents slowly, displaying their bodies on the city's gates as warnings. Even statues of Phocas were cursed by later Byzantines. His face became a symbol of tyranny, his name an insult whispered in fear. And yet for years he ruled unchallenged. But perhaps the darkest truth was this: Rome did not need evil men to commit evil. It only needed systems built on power without consequence, where the Senate bowed, the guard obeyed, and the people suffered in silence. The emperors were a symptom. The disease was the empire itself, because it wasn't just emperors who murdered. Governors ordered crucifixions for sport. Generals wiped out villages as examples. Tax collectors starved provinces into revolt, only to have legions crush them. Gladiators were forced to fight to the death for entertainment. Entire populations were enslaved, broken, and traded. Rome called it order. Even religion, once persecuted, became a weapon. Christian emperors like Theodosius I banned pagan worship and had temples destroyed the same way Nero once torched Christian homes. The names changed. The cruelty did not. By the time the last emperor fell, Rome's marble had cracked, its roads crumbled. But the blood that never dried, because beneath every glorious victory was a massacre. Behind every statue was a corpse. Under every triumphal arch lay the bones of 1,000 slaves. Rome's greatest crime wasn't one emperor's madness. It was centuries of normalized brutality. The idea that lives were tools, loyalty was currency, and cruelty was governance. And even now, millennia later, the stories of those emperors, Caligula, Nero, Elagabalus, Domitian, Commodus, are taught in schools. Often diluted, softened, turned into tales of eccentricity or madness. But the truth is not charming. It is horrifying. These were not misunderstood men. They were executioners, rapists, tyrants, and for generations. Their crimes were not forgotten because they were unknown. They were forgotten because remembering them would mean confronting the system that allowed them to rule. What remains are ruins. Marble columns, cracked amphitheaters, scattered statues. Tourists walk past them every day, admiring the architecture. Few know how many screams those stones once heard.